All right, welcome to our session on historical radio. I'm Sean Bencour, professor in UCLA's Department of Information Studies and director of the Radio Preservation Task Force for the Library of Congress's National Recording Preservation Board. I was delighted to accept the invitation to chair this panel, which includes some exciting new research on several neglected areas of US radio history. We'll start with Mary Hollyman, who will discuss the history of the nation's first all-women radio station, WHER in Memphis. Seth Winner has a double presentation on Marvin Laskowitz, producer at municipal station WNYC in New York, and on Anthony Paterno, who helped found the Arturo Toscanini Society, whose collection Seth has inherited. And then we will wrap with James Stewart discussing the history of the popular but little studied early programming genre of children's programs. Please feel free to post comments in the chat and put your questions for speakers in the Q&A. I'll monitor everything and I will select questions from the Q&A for our speakers to answer once they finish their presentations. I need to approve your Q&A questions before they will actually show up in the queue, so don't be concerned if it takes a bit for them to show up. Mary and James's presentations will run for 20 minutes with 10 minutes of Q&A. Seth has a slightly longer combined presentation in the middle, also with about 10 minutes for Q&A. And just a reminder, this session is being recorded, including all comments you make in the chat and Q&A, so please be mindful of that, and recordings will be accessible to ARSC members through our website. So we're going to start with Mary. Mary Hollyman is an independent researcher from Austin, Texas. She recently received her graduate degree in American Studies from University of Massachusetts in Boston, where her project on station WHER earned her the American Studies Department's Book Prize. Her research focuses on women's involvement in American music and in the history of US radio. She's also a visual artist and hosts her own music show on Real Deep Radio, which you can access on Mixlr.com. Her talk is Beauty Reflected in Sound, Broadcasting Gender Through WHER, the first all-women radio station in the United States. So I'll give it over to Mary now.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. All right. So on October 29th, 1955, in Memphis, Tennessee, listeners tuning into the local radio might have come across the first broadcast from a news station in town. This was WHER's first broadcast, a station marketed as the first all-women radio station in the US. Broadcasting locally at 1,000 watts out of the third ever Holiday Inn, the station featured a working staff of women announcers, disc jockeys, copywriters, and administrators who created programming that targeted Memphis's female listenership, but would also appeal to male audiences as well. While a quote, all-girl operation, the concept for the station and owner was none other than local rock and roll producer Sam Phillips of Sun Studios fame. This first broadcast in 1955 was actually conducted by Marian Keisker, Phillips' assistant at Sun Studios, who herself had an extensive background in radio broadcasting. Although Phillips' creation, WHER's image was the opposite of the fiery and uninhibited rock and roll music that Phillips was cultivating at Sun Studios. Instead, WHER portrayed a vision of pristine, elegant, charming, and white femininity. As WHER announced itself as the first all-women radio station in the US, this presentation today will explore some of the ways WHER maintains socially constructed ideas about women and femininity in the 1950s and 60s, and also how the station pushed against those stereotypes, often utilizing these ideas about women to forward their work on air. Sam Phillips had always dreamed of starting his own radio station, and he worked at various stations before establishing Memphis Recording Service and Sun Studios. He even met his wife, Becky Burns, through his radio work at WLAY in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, the same station where Becky hosted a program with her sister. Phillips' initial idea for a station was one that targeted Black listenership, a radio audience he felt was overlooked, and envisioned a station featuring an all-Black staff, both on air and behind the scenes. However, he abandoned this idea over concerns that he wouldn't be able to compete with the incredibly popular WDIA, the first station in the US to create programming for Black audiences. WDIA had just increased its broadcasting signal to 50,000 watts and expanded to 24-hour broadcasting. Phillips applied his business strategy of targeting overlooked audiences to find a new demographic to cater to, pivoting to Memphis women instead. Thinking in part of Becky's own ability to broadcast and most likely Marion Keisker's own history in radio, Phillips thought that establishing an all-women radio station would provide women with access to more radio positions, and that most of all, the novelty of the idea would pique the general Memphis public's interest. This was also a time when radio had to compete with increasingly popular television programming, and as a result, turned to new and more specific programming ideas to garner an audience. In WHER's case, its identity as an all-women staff station was highly emphasized. The station call letters included the female pronoun her, and it played up the notion that women are inherently tied to an attractive and feminine sensibility. This is succinctly conveyed in the station tagline, 1,000 beautiful watts. All aspects of the station, from its sound, its promotional materials, and even the station space itself, created an aesthetic that was overtly feminized and meant to be pleasing, sophisticated, and beautiful. This was culturally a period of domestic containment for American women, where magazines, TV shows, advertisements, and even politicians encouraged the idea that women should focus on being homemakers, even though more women were in the workforce. While women experienced more opportunities in radio in the 40s due to men fighting in World War II, the radio broadcasting field in the 50s was quite male-dominated, and women's on-air voices were reserved for what was considered, quote, women's topics, such as homemaking shows, educational shows, radio dramas, and advertisements. WHER's aesthetic reflected these gendered conceptions about women. In many articles on the station, and at times on broadcasts themselves, WHER disc jockeys are referred to as the, quote, girls, jockettes, or femjays. The station was decorated almost like a dollhouse, painted in pastel shades with mirrors and studio doors labeled with names like the doll's den or the control room, which was called the playroom. So let's look closer into how the station established itself and also undermined femininity through its sound, visual elements, and the station space itself. As WHER was primarily a music station, the station's sonic choices entirely reflected an effort to create a pleasing and charming sound, one that would be associated with sophisticated femininity. The station had a very strict music policy, only allowing disc jockeys to play easy listening popular music, such as Perry Como, Dean Martin, or Patti Page, as well as ballads, jazz, or classical music, and were forbidden to play any of Phillips' rock and roll recordings from Sun Studios. Phillips wanted to keep both businesses separate, but a larger reason was due to the idea that rock and roll was considered too suggestive, rebellious, and rough for the pleasing aesthetic the station was trying to craft. Becky screened much of the music to make sure it fit the station requirements and adhered to a consistent tempo. She has said in an interview with Davia Nelson and Nikki Silva that Phillips wanted the music to be, quote, beautiful and match the feminine voices. The announcers' broadcasting voices were also important in creating a pleasing, delicate atmosphere. Staff had to demonstrate proper elocution and drop any suggestion of a Southern accent, even though the station only broadcasted within Memphis city limits. Their voices were presented as soft, breathy, and friendly, further creating an overall alluring, delicate, and unthreatening sound to the station. WHER's visuals were also integral to furthering the concept of an all-women space. Although radio is an invisible medium, WHER's on-air voices were repeatedly conflated with their outward appearance. This is exemplified again in the station tagline, 1,000 beautiful watts, as well as the 1960s station lobby, which had a mirror with the words beauty reflected in sound written next to it. A job description for the station includes needing applicants with a, quote, fresh female voice, who must also be, quote, good looking. Additionally, promotional materials such as this station rate card here on the left, or this photograph with women posing with lipstick, include items associated with women, often beauty items, further drawing attention to WHER's own grooming and appearances. Staff were aware of the public's gaze, and being presentable was part of the labor of the job. This need to be visually presentable to the public further allowed listeners to absorb the station's aesthetics and enabled listeners to match announcers' voices with their appearances. And so there's an interesting relationship here at work between listening and visualization or imagination. Becky discusses how important visualization was not only to the listenership, but to the markability and viability of the station. She says, quote, "It was easy to sell because it was so different. The listeners really didn't know what to expect. They used their imagination. They would hear the girls and just kind of picture them in their own minds, blonde or brunette," end quote. Thus, the station's aesthetics helped listeners imagine this all-women space. I won't go into detail here about the station design in the interest of time, but it was fully decorated to play up an all-girl feminine space with pastel colors and doors labeled, things like the playroom for the control room, as I mentioned, as well as a mural of women's undergarments. One article mentions the station manager's door was labeled as "Boss Ma'am." It's clear this was for the public, as the actual broadcasting rooms appear quite plain, but in most articles reporting on the station, its outlandish decoration is always mentioned. Even novelist Erskine Caldwell wrote about it in his novel About Around America, attributing the decoration as something women are naturally compelled to do to spaces. While WHER reflected certain gender expectations about women and femininity, it had moments of staff pushing against these ideas or utilizing these stereotypes to move the station's work forward. Although DJs were required to follow these guidelines of the strict music policy, many disagreed with them and did not enjoy some of the music they played on their show. Betty Berger rebelled against this policy by occasionally slipping in songs she wanted to play on air. In one instance, Berger broadcasted "Love for Sale," a song that was marked as forbidden to play. And when Doug Kazar, the only male station engineer, who's pictured here on the left, called Berger to reprimand her for playing it, Berger claimed that she forgot about the music rules, feigning an unthreatening feminine ignorance without facing repercussions. WHER staff also played up or over-exaggerated the femininity of the station in their on-air speaking. In its initial broadcast, some announcers made mistakes, and listeners started to tune in to hear these mistakes, amused at the idea of women running a station. When staff realized that audiences were listening for these errors, they started to misspeak on purpose, performing mistakes that were clever puns. Staff overemphasized the station's femininity in a way that also poked fun at itself, announcing, quote, "news from abroad," abroad being BROAD, its own word, or stating, quote, "this is the all-girdle station." While staff viewed this as amusement, it also allowed staff to exaggerate and call attention to their station's performance of femininity, thereby chipping away at its facade. Staff also made use of their appearances to achieve success for the station and for themselves in their daily station work. In order to gain advertisers, WHER held a Sadie Hawkins Day event at the Hull Dobbs Ford dealership in 1956. The event involved radio staff dressing up in matching Daisy May costumes from the Lil Abner comic strip while broadcasting live from the sales floor, encouraging customers to purchase cars. In dressing as Daisy May, staff further played up their sex appeal and created an event that put themselves on display, attracting Memphians to the dealership to witness it in person. WHER sold 77 cars that day, the most the dealership had ever sold in their 35-year history, ensuring Ford as an active account for the station. And Elvis himself even stopped by in his pink Cadillac. While WHER perpetuated societal notions of femininity in its image, sound, and space, WHER also subverted these expectations about women on air and created an environment that was often considered empowering by its staff. Given that women's voices in radio had limited on-air speaking opportunities and rarely announced the news or curated music, WHER was unique in its very existence and placement of women in all positions of the station. Although the station had certain music restrictions, staff had creative control over their own programming and commentary and were fully trained in working their own control board. As the station progressed through the 60s, the programming stepped away from, quote, women's programming and started to include more news reporting, especially as the Vietnam War escalated. WHER also reported on the sanitation workers' strike, Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, and subsequent protests. They introduced sportscasting to the station repertoire, featuring golfer Peggy Sternberger reporting on local tournaments. Sternberger was often the only woman reporter on site at many men's golf tournaments. The station further changed with the addition of Marge Thrasher, who really made the station popular with her highly successful show, Open Mic. This was an open forum style show that would take on a current topic, often political, address both sides of the topic, and open the phone lines to listeners to voice their personal opinions. The show featured quite a variety of guests, and Thrasher was the first broadcaster to interview an openly gay man on air in Memphis. Lastly, what I find particularly interesting about WHER is how it served as a stepping stone for staff's future careers. For Betty Berger, WHER was her first professional experience after getting a divorce. And she said it was where she first felt independence. She went on to be a successful booking agent in Memphis and started her own agency, Continental Artists. She was the only woman booking agency at one point in Memphis and booked acts for Stax Records and High Records. Phyllis Timbert Patterson, a young staffer, went on to establish the very first Renaissance Fair in California, which became a hub of countercultural activity and began the whole Renaissance Fair concept. Marge Thrasher went on to establish the Memphis chapter of the American Women in Radio and Television with Jan Garner. And Marion Keisker, Phillips' assistant, left Sun Studios in WHER to be an officer in the Air Force, running the Armed Forces Television in Germany, the largest facility in the world. When she returned to Memphis in the 70s, she founded the Memphis chapter of the National Organization for Women. Ultimately, the station's characterization of femininity disappeared entirely once the station became co-ed in the 1970s. Interestingly, as more men became involved in the station, WHER staff expressed feeling more restricted and confined to gender roles. WHER dissolved in 1972, right as the women's movement was taking effect, and its politics never completely expressed a full-on articulation of or rejection of the patriarchy. However, WHER did serve as a workplace for women to collaborate on a daily basis and create their own work environment. 2 years into WHER's operations, Dottie Abbott, station manager, was quoted in an article saying, quote, "We are not trying to prove that we can get along in a world without men. We are simply trying to prove that when a group of women make up their collective minds that they're going to do something successfully, no force on earth can keep them from it," quote. Although not a radical endeavor, WHER represented a fascinating intervention into the radio broadcasting landscape that placed women in every role in the station and exhibited women in these roles consistently for almost 20 years. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mary. So just a reminder that if you would like to ask a question to Mary, go ahead and put that in the Q&A, please. We have a couple of questions already here, Mary. Let me just convey these to you. Question from Maristel Fusel about how they got the call letters, WHER. And then there's another question from Laura Schnicker about any surviving air checks you may be aware of.
Yeah, so I'm not sure who came up with the idea for the call letters or what that process was. I do know that Sam Phillips' wife, Becky Phillips, was highly involved in the planning of the station. So it's possible it was maybe her idea, but yeah, I haven't found anything about what that process looked like. In terms of surviving tracks, I have to give a shout out to the Kitchen sisters, Nikki Silva and Davia Nelson, because they've did a really wonderful radio documentary that aired on NPR about the station. And that documentary features snippets from broadcasts. So I was able to listen to those that way, but I myself haven't been able to find any broadcasts. There are some broadcasts of Marge Thrasher's show, Open Mic, which I have listened to. And those are at the University of Maryland archive, I believe. And those are really interesting, and kind of interesting to hear the Memphis public calling in and expressing their opinions on a whole range of mostly political topics at the time.
Yeah, and on that note, Mary, I know you wanted to say a bit more as well about where you got some materials for this research.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the Kitchen Sisters really provided a lot of really great artifacts. They conducted a lot of really enriching interviews with the women. And I've also found some kind of great oral history transcripts with Marian Keisker. And also there's so many newspaper articles from local Memphis papers. Another kind of great resource were a lot of billboard magazines. It was really interesting to see how a lot of reporters spoke about the station and how they described it themselves.
And we have a question here from Tim Brooks as well, wondering about information on audience size and market ranking. I know you said the station underwent several changes over the years, so that may have shifted as it went along, but yeah.
Yeah, I haven't found the exact kind of numbers. It's been a bit challenging to figure out what the audience reactions to, or what people thought about the station. It did broadcast at 1,000 watts, so very local, but based on what kind of things I've read about what people have said about it, it was kind of the people who did tune in really enjoyed it. It did seem that the reason why it went co-ed was kind of partly because I think they wanted to try to appeal to younger listeners. And so they did change the music. They started to play more like adult contemporary music into the late 60s and less kind of the easy listening ballad type music that it was playing before. But it seems like both men and women tuned into the station, and that although they said they were keyed to women, they also did really kind of try to cater to male audiences as well.
Now, during that shift, Steve Ramis just asked, did the call letters change, or did they stick with WHER across their whole history?
Yes, the call letters did change to, instead of her, they changed it to we. So it was WWE, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Now, I'm curious, Mary, you were talking about the visuality of the station, right, being so important for public perception, inviting audiences to engage with the station as a brand, but also the programming in certain ways, and to understand, the on-air personalities, shape their understanding of them. I wonder if there are kind of broader ramifications for this being a radio history panel, right? For doing the work of radio history with what we look at, right? Because it suggests that there's a lot more to the sound medium than just the sound recordings.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the research for me, was that because I couldn't really get my hands on a lot of broadcasts, what I did notice was that there are a lot of photographs and promotional items that are available to look at and analyze. And even thinking about the way the station was decorated, the decor was really over the top. They clearly used that as like a way to further establish the station for the public. So it kind of became apparent to me that this station really, in order to understand it, even though it was mostly on air, it really was this kind of 3D experience where the visuals are really working in time with the sound of the station. And it seems like a lot of the staff really were involved in the Memphis community. They would show up a lot to public events. And they even had a deal with a local hair salon where they could get free haircuts and manicures and all of that. So it seems like their appearances and how they presented themselves really tied into their broadcasts. I think looking at visuals and branding and all of that is a really wonderful way to kind of further understand how stations are trying to communicate their programming to audiences. And this was really interesting, especially this time period of the 1950s and 60s, and also in Memphis, which itself was experiencing such interesting changes too in that time.
Yeah, and this the other one second. I just want to get this in the Q&A so other people can see it too. So did the staff, you were talking about some of the staffing changes. There's a question here. Did the staff remain all white throughout the course of the stations, or did that change as things went along as well?
Yeah, so interestingly, WHER only had one Black woman staffer, and she joined the station kind of in the 60s, like the late 60s. Other than that, it was an all-white station. Something that was also interesting to think about was, I haven't found pictures of her at all, but in the 1960s, the station location changed from the Holiday Inn to the Mid-City building in downtown Memphis. And at that location, they had a broadcasting booth where anyone from the street could just come in and look at the DJs conducting their shows. And the staff actually called it the fishbowl because you're kind of just on display to everyone. And so that staffer did mention in an interview with Nikki Silva and Davia Nelson that at times being the only Black broadcaster was challenging, and that you would get kind of, I think she felt a bit exposed being in the booth, sometimes getting kind of people gawking at her a little bit. But she said in terms of working with staff that she didn't feel discriminated against, really. It was just when she was in the station booth, if there were any kind of, I think they described them as, sometimes you get scary people coming in and watching, just staring at you broadcasting. That was the only time she really felt uncomfortable, she says. But yeah, it's interesting that even, I think, as a co-ed station in the early 70s, I believe it was all white, but definitely as WHER, it was entirely white, except for that one broadcaster.
And just going back to one of your earlier points too, because you were just talking about the importance of being connected to the local community, right, with all of these outreach events. But I know that you said earlier on too that they weren't allowed to use local accents, right, that would tie them as in any way Southern. Were there aspirations initially for them to go beyond that smaller market, or were there any tensions there between local or larger regional or national aspirations?
Yeah, well, interestingly, Dottie Abbott, who was the first station manager, left to go establish another radio station that Sam Phillips started in Florida called WLIZ. And that was another all-women radio station that Phillips owned. So it seems like they expanded a bit, but I haven't found anything where they've kind of mentioned being more nationally minded. I have seen, though, that a lot of the staff, when they kind of went on to future careers, some of them did go into kind of more national broadcasting. But I do think that the Southern accent thing, I think it's kind of, in an interview with one of the staffers, they mentioned how you need to do, quote, radio talk, like you need to sound kind of professional. And so I think that that was part of the station trying to be taken seriously in a way, that this, or trying to sound kind of people to hear them and sound that they were, make them think they were professional and authoritative, since they were kind of doing this new station concept.
Yeah, a definite politics of voice there, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, Mary, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, for sharing your research with us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
this is great.
Yeah, thank you.